Okay, we are recording for our long exposure slow shutter editing demo. So I gathered some photos from Torrey Pines. Is actually a good area to shoot. It's the closest area to where we live to shoot night sky photos. And so because it is like a nature preserve and there's not a lot of lights super close to it, like the closest ones are La Jolla and Del Mar, and there's like a section where lights are pretty far away from it, so you don't have as much light pollution, which is good. And so certain times of year, especially in the summer months, the Milky Way will show up in the northern hemisphere and you can shoot it. So this one I shot at Torrey Pines over the ocean. This is La Jolla down here on the left, if you're interested. This was this was actually kind of near Del Mar facing south, like right before you dip down before the Torrey Pines beach. There's kind of some parking and you can shoot kind of cliffs facing south. So I did a long exposure of the cliff and then I had my camera on a tripod. So I kept it in the same spot and then took a photo of my wife. This was a 1 second exposure. I was just lighting her with that little lume cube light. So this was a 1 second exposure. And this was, what was the time on this one? This was a 25-second exposure. So you can kind of see the Milky Way show up, but because it's such a short exposure, we need to basically get it brighter to show up these, faint Milky Way lights because they're, not as bright. So then I just increase the time. So then using Photoshop, I basically painted in the Milky Way, to the horizon and basically masking out the area around her using a layer mask so that way it didn't go on top of her, right? So that was pretty nice. So the other example was, sorry, I'm just gonna have to take these dudes off, is with light painting, you can point the light towards the subject and light them, or you can turn the light so it faces the camera. So this was using that little lume cube light. I lit her for a couple of seconds and then I pointed towards the camera. So this photo was actually a 10-second exposure. So it gave me enough time to basically point the light at her for 3 or 4 seconds and then point the light towards the camera and then capture that motion. And same with the car examples I did, on the prior demo, where anytime you point the light towards the camera, it's going to show up, and anytime the light's pointing towards your subject, it's going to light your subject. And so these ones were, this was a 25-second exposure. I wanted more time to light up the car, right? So for the editing demo, what I was going to show was how we can basically enhance, a long exposure light painting photo. So I'm just going to make a quick duplicate. So always make a copy before you edit your photos. Right click on it, it's like make a copy and then paste it, or if you're in Bridge, it gives you a duplicate option. So I'm just gonna open this in Camera Raw. Again, Camera Raw is very similar to Photoshop Express on the smartphone. So if you're editing on a smartphone, a lot of these sliders are very similar, right? You got exposure sliders, contrast, highlight, shadows, color temperature, vibrant saturation. You also have the clarity and dehaze sliders on Photoshop Express. And you also have split toning. So if you wanted to change the colors of these, we could do it too in our split toning, either in Camera Raw, Lightroom, or Photoshop Express, all has the same features. So depending on how you shot your photos, maybe your photos are dark and you may need to bring up the exposure. Maybe they're too bright and you need to bring down the exposure. So that's really up to how you shot your photos, what you're going to need to do to adjust exposure. So I'm just going to bring it up a little bit. And if I turn on these warnings, what these show me is if it's red, it's so bright it's losing information, and if it's blue, it is so black it's losing information. So sometimes I keep those on just to get an idea. Sometimes I turn them off just so I can see my photo really well and to see like, okay, how bright do I want my subject when I'm editing? So if I go to the highlights, again, it's the same as Photoshop Express, I could increase just the highlights by themselves, or I could darken the highlights, depending on what look I'm going for. So I'm just going to bring in my highlights a little bit. I can also bring up the shadows. When I do that, you can see how they're showing up. So some of the light's going on me as I'm moving around her during those 10 seconds. And so if you are light painting, wear a lot of black clothing, so then it doesn't reflect on you, you don't show up as much. But obviously, you know, it is because I'm showing up. So I'm just going to get to a point where she looks good and the exposure looks good, but I'm not showing up. So the one I would consider is the clarity slider. You can see when I increase it, how it kind of brings up, especially these light streaks really well. This is before, you know, and after. You can kind of see how it really kind of brings out those light painting streaks. If you want to have more control, I would do this in Photoshop. But if you're just using Photoshop Express on a smartphone, I would just, increase that clarity slider, and then I'll apply it to the whole photo, but it will bring out your texture and bring out those light streaks if you are doing light painting. You can also play with your vibrance, you know, depending on your colors. Maybe you shot it and the temperature's wrong, and you want to like warm it up, or you got like a tint, you want to fix the tint. What I would consider for this is split toning. So split toning lets you change the colors of the highlights and the shadows independently. It is in Photoshop Express, so you just swipe through the different options in Photoshop Express. You'll see a split toning option, and basically just drag one for the highlights, one for the shadows. So if I turn on the saturation to my highlights, I'm just going to max it out so you can see it easy. You can see it's adding colors to the bright areas. And so if I change the hue, right, I can go change it to different hues depending on what look I want, right? You can kind of some are brighter or darker depending on which hue you select. And then you can kind of see it's adding colors to these highlights. So keep in mind, if I'm doing this in Photoshop Express or Camera Raw or Lightroom, it's applying it to the whole photo. So if I want to have more control, I would recommend using photop.com or Photoshop. So what I'm going to do, and you could do a separate color for your shadows. So I can turn this on, maybe put like a blue color in the shadows. And then you can also play with the balance too. So if you want more in the shadows or more color in the highlights, you can kind of play with how much it mixes it. So I'm just going to zero these back out and show you in Photoshop what I would do. But that's a good option if you can't, you know, if you don't have Photoshop or don't want to use Photop. So I'm just going to open this up. So again, Photoshop and Photop are very similar. Everything I'm showing is the same in Photop. So it's just going to open up this file. All right. So what I could do, and what I recommend, especially if I'm doing light painting where I have like light streaks or I want to change colors on something, I would want to use selective color. So down here below your layers is a little half and half circle. You can click here and choose selective color. And what it does is it adds an adjustment layer with a layer mask, which is very nice. So if I mess up, I can throw this in the trash and add a new one. Just like it's the same in Photop. You can also go to Image, Adjustments, and do Selective Color. Here, the problem is here, it lets you do the changes. So if I go and change some colors real quick, just to kind of show you, right? It is on that layer now. And I can't go back, I can't undo it, I can't modify it in any way. So it's a very destructive way of editing. So I'm just going to go back a step in my history, or just go to Edit, undo, Command Z, Control Z. So I wouldn't do the image adjustment way. I would go down here and do an adjustment layer and select selective color. So now it's on a separate layer and it has a layer mask. So I'm just going to go. So I can change the colors of every color: red, yellows, greens, cyans, blues, magentas. Whites is the one I want to change for my light painting, right? Those are white highlights. So how this works is cyan, if I drag it to the left, will add basically kind of like an orangey red. And then to the right, it adds cyan. I'm just going to put that back to 0. If I drag magenta to the left, it will kind of add a green. And to the right, it will add magenta. And then yellow is basically just the opposites of the color wheel. Left, it makes it more blue. Right, it makes it more yellow. And then the last slider here says black. So if I drag to the left, it'll make the whites whiter. And if I drag it to the right, it'll make the whites blacker, right? So you can do kind of cool, interesting looks with that. It has an option for relative or absolute. I'll put on absolute. I'm doing that for the demo just so it shows it more. It's a much stronger version of changing the colors. All right, so what I'm gonna do is just kind of add some colors to my whites. Let's do kind of like a turquoisey blue. Maybe add a little magenta with that. And then I can adjust the blacks and how bright I want it to go. So left it'll go brighter, right it'll go darker. So depending on the look of it you want. So because I have a layer mask attached, I can just tell it where I want it to go. So I'm just going to press Control I or Command I on the Mac to invert it. So I'm turning that white layer mask to black. I'm going to select my brush tool. I'm going to make sure it is set to white. So white's on the top. If not, I can pick the color white. I can adjust the size of my brush. I can make it a hard edge or a soft edge. Make sure my flow is at 100%, right? And then wherever I pin with white will show that change, right? You can see my layer mask where I'm painting with white here. So then what I would do is just kind of take my time painting in where I want it to go and avoiding the dress. So I'm just going to do this kind of quick and kind of rough. I would definitely, spend more time, doing it so it looked nicer and better. If I was doing this, I would basically zoom in, take my brush, and then paint through. And then if I paint it on the dress, I just switch this to black and then paint it off, right? So I can, white shows, black doesn't show in a layer mask. Another option I can do is you can really fine tune an adjustment layer if you right click next to the layer, or actually double click, and it gives you layer style and blending modes, and it's got this blend if. So you can actually play with this. This is really advanced, but I'm just kind of showing you what you can do. So with the underline layer, I'm just going to pull up the amount. So I'm actually going to zoom in. You can kind of see what's happening here. So I'm basically saying I just want this highlight area to show of this layer. And so you can see here how it kind of affects the layer. It looks kind of rough here. So if I hold Alt or Option, I can break this apart and make that transition a little smoother. And then I just kind of keep adjusting it. So that is kind of useful. So that way it's kind of helping some of these edges here. Layer style blending modes are very useful for retouching. So just letting you know the different things you can do. So let's say I'm happy with this photo. I'm just going to go layer and then flatten those layers. So flatten image. Same as photo P. Same where you find everything, layer flatten image. So now I can save this out as a JPEG. So I'm just going to go File, Save As. It's already a copy, so I'm just going to make sure the format is a JPEG so I can upload it to Flickr or to a Google Slide, and then hit Save, make sure my quality is good, and it'll save it out. So then, just going to let it close. So this was my, I'm actually going to take this one off. This is my original photo, and then this was my edit. So you can see here, I had those overall changes where I aligned the exposure, brought out the shadows and the highlights, added some clarity, and brought that out. And then in Photoshop, I obviously changed the color of my highlights, right, using the selective color mode. So for photo P, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open this up again and then save it as a JPEG, because this right now is like an 86 megabyte TIFF. I use RAW and TIFF, so I have less compressed files. Typically when I shoot in photography, I started out shooting all JPEGs, and then I wanted higher quality, so then I switched that to shooting in RAW and saving out as uncompressed TIFFs. But I still need to save out JPEGs for when I upload it to my website. So I'm just going to save this dude as JPEG, like so. and then go to photop.com and open up that file. So go File, Open, and then just navigate to your folder, right? So this one was, I think, this photo. Yeah. And so if I didn't, I wasn't doing this in Photoshop Express, and this would be the same as Photoshop, I could use the high pass like we did in the action photos to bring out the details of our light painting. So what I would do is go to Layer and copy my layer, so duplicate layer. It's going to make a copy here. I'm going to go to Filter, Other High Pass. Photop is a little slower than Photoshop. It is a free application through the web. Actually, I'm going to close out my Photoshop just to kind of help things run smoother. Okay. So back in Photop, depending on how big your light source is or the radius, you can adjust the radius size. I'm going to do about 30. It will bring out the details in a pretty good way for this photo. The radius really depends on the resolution of your photo and the amount of details you want to change. So this is the high pass applied. Looks kind of weird, so I just need to change my blending mode of my layer. So just click where it says normal above your layers, and then overlay, soft light, or hard light are the main three. So this is before and after. You can see how it's bringing out these details, very similar to the clarity, right? So I'm just going to do overlay. It's a little too strong. There we go. And again, with the layer mask, so I just click on this little logo here, and it says Add Raster Mask. That's Photop's name for it, layer mask in Photoshop. So if you click on that, adds that. I'm going to invert it so it's black. So press Control or Command I. Control I on a PC, Command I on a Mac. I'm going to go to my brush tool, just like in Photoshop. I can switch it between black and white, or select the color white if I need to. I get options for the brush tool, so I can change the size of the brush. I can make sure it's a soft edge. I can change the flow and the opacity of my brush, right? So then wherever I paint with white, I'm basically applying that high pass filter and kind of helping to bring out, those highlights well, and the light painting, just the lights in general really well. So kind of just emphasizing it so it's much stronger. I'm just kind of going around painting those sections. Hey, come on. This is very similar to clarity, but I get to control where that clarity goes in effect. So that's because I have it on a layer mask. So I'm just going to kind of zoom in just so you see a little better. You can see in the layer mask for pan, this is off and on, right? So if I have it on areas I don't want it to, I just switch that to black, and then I can paint it off on the areas I don't want it to go to. So you pick and choose, which details you want to bring out on your long exposures. And the opposite, if I wanted something like super smooth, I would just click on the image part of it, the layer, so that's selected, and then just press Control I, and it'll invert it and soften it. So depending on what look you're going for, you might want like super smooth water, like you did a long exposure of like water moving, and you could invert it. So once I'm done, I'm just going to invert that back. I'm just going to go layer, same as before in Photoshop, flatten image. And then we're just going to go File, Export as in Photop, and then just select JPEG. And then, make sure your quality is good, save it out, and I'll download it to your desktop. So it's going to save it down here. So again, Photop, Photoshop are very similar. The stuff I showed in Camera Raw is very similar to Photoshop Express on the smartphone, or Lightroom if you have that. There's also a Lightroom app as well. Cool, so I'm just going to stop the recording.